So I'm delighted to be joined in this first session live from Washington, D.C., RSM Chief Economist, Joe Brusuelas. Hello, Joe. Good morning to you.
Good afternoon to everybody out there. Thanks, Simon. As always, it's good to talk to you.
Likewise. Look, Joe, I don't know about you, but going into COP26 at Glasgow, the world was projected to be on a trajectory of an increase in average temperatures of 2.7 degrees by the year 2100 compared to pre-industrial levels. And it seems that there's been a lot of progress, surprisingly so, during this conference. The number of pledges has been magnificent. Clearly, there's a lot of people that are arguing, some more vocally than others on the streets of Glasgow, that not enough is being done and certainly not fast enough. But if you look at some of the reports, and particularly I was taken by Joe Biden's special envoy to COP26, John Kerry, when he said that if everyone delivers what they've said they're going to deliver, we're going to be at a degree increase of 1.8. Do you think he's being optimistic, Joe, or is that is that something we should really take as a positive?
No, I think that's a good and encouraging and constructive starting point for an integrated global response to the risks around climate change. I think it's achievable and it's reasonable that governments begin to increasingly cooperate, collaborate, and think about how to address these issues. It's important that we have an open and honest dialogue around what's going to be a long and somewhat bumpy transition towards renewables and a carbon-free future. Of course, what we're going through as we emerge from the pandemic is going to make that discussion that much more difficult. And some of us are going to have to learn to accept yes for an answer and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But for now, I am somewhat encouraged that we're going to achieve what was set out at COP21. And I think that the targets that are emerging thus far are doable and reasonable.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the rhetoric from some of the counter reports coming out. The group Climate Action Tracker of independent scientists is saying, well, if all the pledges that have been made are delivered, it's not going to be only a 1.8 degree rise. It will be a 2.4 degree rise. And I guess for me, that's half the problem, is that none of us really know. And these conflicting issues and views can actually cloud people's views and judgments about the effectiveness of the work that's being done at COP26. I suppose also, I guess like anything, it's not so much what happens at COP26. The important thing is what happens afterwards, what actions actually come to pass. Joe, before we get onto the conversation, I just thought it would be worthwhile just summarising, just really briefly, what some of the objectives were of Conference of the Parties number 26. There were 4 key objectives. The first one being the drive towards net zero. The second being around communities and habitats. The third, which, Joe, will be close to your heart, is mobilizing finance to address the climate emergency globally. And the fourth aspect was around building on the 2016 COP21, the Paris Agreement. Let's just quickly take a very quick whistle-stop tour over those aspects. So in terms of net zero, here you can see on screen what the objectives were. Secure that net zero number by 2050, try and keep the 1.5 degree rise in sight, and also that major drive in terms of reversing deforestation, continuing the drive towards electric vehicles, phasing out coal usage, etc. All good stuff, and we'll come on to how we've been doing against some of those. And then the other aspects around habitat, you can see these on screen at the moment. I mean, I find it's extraordinary. There was an article on Bloomberg Green during earlier this week, and today is actually COP26, the Environment and Cities Day. It was talking about Glasgow and also New York in terms of the carbon emissions that come from both of those cities, 66% of those emissions come from buildings. So in terms of addressing habitat and re-engineering, retrofitting buildings is going to be massively important to this objective. The third aspect is around mobilizing finance, and there was also previously the pledge of $100 billion a year, which was in the lead up to COP26, which hasn't been achieved. And it's going to be interesting, Joe, to see whether actually major economies are going to actually deliver against that during the follow-up to COP26. And then finally, it was around the Paris Agreement in terms of making those legally binding agreements come to pass and just holding people to account in terms of what was expected in terms of limiting global emissions to a maximum of 2%, but really going for the 1.5% maximum by the mid-21st century even. There's also that aspect around mobilizing finance. And, Joe, you can see here on the screen that's just coming up now in terms of, every financial decision, it's going to be resonating with every business, every institution, every decision that's going to be made over infrastructure. I know, Joe, that in the US, the infrastructure bill, I think, was passed yesterday. That type of initiative is what's going to be needed by the major economies, particularly in the US.
Well, that's correct. That we're going to need to make our energy resources move towards a renewable future, but also to be resilient in the face of climate shock. In the United States, we're beginning to build the rudimentary system whereby we can service the electric vehicles, which are our future mode of individual transportation. That doesn't exist except really in very few buildings around a select number of urban centers or in people's homes. So there's room for growth there in a way that will accent the middle market, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, as we move towards a fleet of vehicles that is completely relies on electricity. Now, that means we're going to have to boost storage capacity. There's all sorts of innovations that are going to have to happen over the next decade in order to achieve those goals laid out, whether it be in COP21, and we're going to hold those people to account, or the goals that are going to come out of COP26. Nevertheless, that sort of public-led investment is absolutely critical to moving towards reducing the risks around climate shock and climate change.
Well, and certainly the use of private finance and that use of R&D and investment in new technology is going to be critical. We did a survey as part of our Real Economy survey earlier this year on infrastructure, and it's the same point you just made there, Joe, about the infrastructure around electric vehicles. We're exactly the same here in the UK in terms of, can the infrastructure of the UK at the moment cope with any future demand for a transition from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles? And the question is, there's work to be done, or the view is there's work to be done. And the final objective of COP26 was around the use of what the financial sector is going to be doing in terms of its reporting and its risk management, the type of returns it's going to be doing, and mobilization. And I know that your old boss, Mike Bloomberg, is chairing the climate task force on financial disclosures relating to climate change. Maybe that type of engagement of a global standard set of financial disclosures relating to climate is what is needed for big business in order to change what they're doing. And it'll be interesting when we get to our panel session with our guests who are coming from big organizations to see whether they have been addressing these type of issues. But in terms of some of the outcomes, I don't want to go through what's been pledged during COP26. I think we've all been reading the news and we've been seeing the media analysis that's come out. But I think it's just worth just spending a couple of moments just reflecting. For me, in terms of the the drive towards net zero. It's interesting that India has committed to be net zero by 2070. Disappointing that they're not aligning to the 2050 deadline, but at least they've made a commitment for the first time. Likewise, China, albeit they haven't done it at COP26, has said that they're aiming for net zero by 2060. More than 130 countries have signed up to a promise to end deforestation and actually reverse it, including, Joe, the kind of last standing populist leader of Bolsonaro of Brazil. Has that been a surprise when you heard Bolsonaro was signing up to that type of pledge, or do you think this is just more just a soundbite?
No, I'm not surprised. We all like to think of the fight against climate change and climate shock as global, but it also has profoundly local implications. And Mr. Bolsonaro has been under significant pressure from domestic elements within his own party and outside of his own party to address the growing risks around deforestation and climate change inside Brazil. So that is one of the more constructive and encouraging elements that's come out of COP26. And I think that suggests there's further policy space there to achieve even more objectives, even at what's going to be a very difficult time here around supply chain disruptions and oil prices for the global economy over the next year or so.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that one certainly caught my eye in terms of that pledge. And actually that deforestation commitment is being supported by a pledge to provide $20 billion of public finance from 12 countries, including the UK, between now and 2025. There was the announcement on the pledge to cut methane emissions, which is, as we all know, a highly damaging greenhouse gas. That pledge was by 30% down by 2030, and more than 100 countries signed up for that. And more than 190 countries have created a coalition in terms of the shift away from coal power. And that's included the major coal producing and coal using countries of Poland, Vietnam, Egypt, and Chile. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't yet been signed up by the coal-dependent economies of Australia, India, China, and the United States. Are we ever going to see the United States move away from its dependency on coal, Joe?
Yeah, we will. It's not going to happen immediately. And it's largely going to be due to the evolution in the price of natural gas. Now, we are going through something of a shock right now, not just in the United States, but in the UK and across Europe with respect to the price of natural gas. And this is very illustrative of what I meant when I said earlier, it's going to be a long and bumpy transition, right? There are some things that will occur that over time will be a net benefit in the fight against climate shock. However, the use of coal, whether we're talking the United States, India, or China, is going to be part of the energy mix going forward, hopefully at reduced levels. Nevertheless, we need to move forward and continue progress in that area. My sense is once we get through the next year and a half, as some of the disruptions caused by the supply chain and disruptions to supply chain around the pandemic ease, we'll begin to see utilization of coal decline, but it's going to be a very contentious point in the short term.
Well, I think in terms of that, the US and also China as the two large economies here, there was the announcement just last night in terms of the cooperation agreement between those two nations in terms of climate mitigation. So maybe there's signs that public pressure is changing. I guess whilst you're in Washington at the moment, what is the mood music over there at the moment? Is politically as well as in the general public to the whole climate emergency?
Well, to be honest with you, COP26 is probably second or third on the list right now. Clearly, Washington's concerned about the disruptions caused by the bottlenecks around the global supply chain and rising inflation. It's a very difficult discussion to have at a time when you see the price of gasoline or petrol and food rising. People who um, are in the middle of the income spectrum or down market are trying to understand why we need to and increase cut back on fossil fuels, which to them means higher prices at a time when they're observing some pain around rising inflation. So this is what I mean when I say that in the near term, it's going to be a very challenging year or so. Even though things are moving in the right direction, the leaders in the advanced economies are going to have to find a better discourse in which to communicate to their public why this is important. And it's going to have to be one, I think, that's organized around hey, there is a way that results in a better world, in a better economy, one that's more sustainable. But we need to be open and honest about, yeah, it's going to be long, it's going to be bumpy, and in some cases, it will lead to higher prices. We can't sell this as a panacea and it's all going to be, we're all going to get together, hold hands, and sing kumbaya. That's not how this is going to evolve. So here in Washington, it's a very difficult conversation that's going on right now between the leaders of the American government and an American public that's, to be honest with you, a bit sour coming out of 2 years of lockdown around the pandemic. Lots of factors at play influencing that right now. Nevertheless, the conversation needs to go on.
Well, absolutely, the conversation needs to go on, and I probably would say, and there's probably some people listening to this who'll say, "Well, gee whiz, America, that's no different to the UK or Germany or France or anywhere else. Wake up and smell the coffee." So I hope that the political discourse will continue, and the fact that, I think the fact that John Kerry, by all accounts, has been incredibly active during the conference is a sign that America is at the party on this one. But Joe, your point in terms of the timing is going to be a tough couple of years. On the slide here is your outlook for the global economy. I mean, this is off the back of obviously the pandemic, but as you've mentioned and touched on, there's the risk of inflation rearing its head again. That's certainly coming. There's been the supply chain disruptions. And there's the threat in the UK that the interest rates will soon be rising at some stage, whether it's later this year or in early 2022. What is your take on the macro position of the global economy?
Well, we're going to have a pretty good year of growth, probably close to 6%, followed by 4.5% next year on a global basis. Clearly, the United States is going to be leading the growth path out of the pandemic. I think that we are going to see in the near term some of the major central banks begin to tighten and indeed hike rates. Traditionally, when you come out of recessions, especially deep recessions, you do see some frictions that cause inflation to temporarily overshoot the long-term trend. That's occurring in addition to the profound disruption in the global supply chains. Well, in the UK and the US, we've gone through several waves of the pandemic in places like Vietnam, which is an incredibly important cog in the global supply chain around apparel, around footwear, consumer goods such as luggage, children's toys. They're just going through the first wave, and they're just going to begin to emerge from a significant lockdown early next year. So I don't expect to see those supply chain concerns ease probably until the third quarter of 2022. What that means is you're probably going to see the onset of rate hikes in the United States pulled forward. Indeed, we may see a rate hike in the UK as early as December, although we urge the Bank of England to proceed with extreme caution and remember the risks to the real economy, not just the city of London, and indeed even here in the United States. The Fed clearly wants to make sure the recovery is inclusive and is far more concerned about the real conditions in the real economy than I think other central banks, other versions of the Federal Reserve have coming out of past recessions when a really preference was given to the financial center in New York and financial conditions overall. Inflation's going to run hot for a period of time. My sense is, though, this is not a repeat of the 1970s, nor does it have to be. We clearly are seeing some pretty big disruptions. The price of shipping, the availability, or rather the quantity of goods, and the limited choice out there clearly are some concerns. And of course, the price of food, which was up 5.1% on a year ago basis here in the United States. Petrol alone, the price of gasoline in the US was up 4.5% in October. These are clearly resulting in strains and stresses in consumers' pocketbooks. And of course, the higher the inflation, the lower real wages are. And indeed, real wages are now declining in the United States. No one likes a pay cut around inflation. So you should expect to hear policymakers around the world forthrightly address this. And I think that there are many steps that central banks can take, but they need to do it in a gradual and orderly fashion in a way that's clearly communicated, not just to investors, but the broader public.
Well, I think your slide here about what's driving global growth is quite interesting. But I'm also minded that yes, inflationary pressures are hitting consumers. They're hitting consumers here in the UK. We've had a very similar situation in terms of energy prices, fuel prices that are going to higher levels on a weekly basis. At a time when we're asking businesses to address the climate emergency and invest in greener outcomes, this couldn't come at a worse time, could it? Or is this always going to happen? This is just the difference between short-termism and the longer-term ultimate goal of climate mitigation.
So I think that this is part of that difficult conversation that we're going to have with the public around this. This is not especially well timed if you want to move towards a greener future because it directly involves higher cost. Now, here in the United States, and every economy is going to be different. We got the inflation data yesterday, and we rapidly decomposed it. What do I see? I see 62% of what's driving inflation is clustered in about 30% of the index. It's basically energy, transportation, and industrial supplies. They're the pandemic impacted sectors. That implies they'll ease as supply chains get back up and running. For example, the cost of used and new cars is up significantly over the past year. And that has to do with the relatively limited availability of very sophisticated microchips. You know, the average automobile has thousands of pieces of software in it these days. You're really driving very sophisticated computers, not just automobiles these days. So that limited availability has substantially increased costs. Now we expect those to return to longer term trends going forward later next year. Okay. That doesn't mean we're not going to continue to move towards an all electric vehicle fleet. Indeed, the two major American auto producers, Ford and GM, are committed to having a complete 100% EV fleet by 2030, so in less than a decade. That will significantly advance U.S. economic interest and interest around a cleaner, more greener, and sustainable future. But right now, that involves individuals around the United States paying $4 per gallon for fuel. And while that's cheap by UK and European standards,
that's incredibly cheap by UK standards.
Right. And again, that's the difficult conversation that we're going to have with the public.
You mentioned supply chains earlier and the disruption to supply chains, but the increased cost of global supply chains. I'm just wondering if there is an opportunity here that aligns both short-term economic needs with the longer-term climate emergency. In terms of what do I mean by that? Well, look, we've run on a very lean operating model in terms of just-in-time supply chains for 30, 40 years. Is this now a time to remodel the global supply chain in terms of more nearshoring, finding sources of products that are more environmentally friendly because we're not spending a fortune to transport them from one side of the globe to another?
Well, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste. There's always opportunities inside crises to reinvent and remodel what you're doing. Now, the fact that global firms have spent trillions of dollars establishing these global supply chains over the past 30 years likely implies that you're not going to see wholesale change. But on the margin, there will be opportunities, not for reshoring, that's a misnomer. I'm very uncomfortable with that, but opportunities for new investment in supply chains that are near or in economic areas. For example, here in North America, it's very clear that there was going to need to be a protective a PPE supply chain, protective gear, and
Hmm.
life sciences in case we run into these pandemics again. That's going to be set up here in North America, and it makes sense that it should, in addition to a prospective supply chain that may be built in the American desert that produces very sophisticated advanced microchips. Okay, sure. The American government's allocated billions of dollars to help jumpstart that and subsidize that. There's a debate around whether that's going to make sense and whether we should be competing with the more advanced chips that are made in Northwest Europe, for example, that are the ones that really we need and that are becoming more available every day here. But because of geostrategic concerns and real legitimate political concerns around what's happening in Northeast Asia, specifically around China and Taiwan, these things that are going to move forward. So we'll want to watch this. But my sense here is we're going to need to innovate our way out of this.
Yeah.
3D printing, more customized uh, product provision around supply chains that are localized, perhaps is a path forward to a more sustainable future. But I would not suggest or even imply that you're going to see wholesale change. I mean, large change around global supply chains as we emerge into what's going to be a very competitive, indeed a hyper competitive and hyper productive post pandemic economy in the world.
I'm not sure. I find that kind of disappointing, really. I would have hoped that we would have slightly changed the view in terms of our consumerism that we've been following for the last 50, 60 years. And, if we're not going to change it now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we're ever going to change it, and if that means it's all a bit too late. There was certainly an article I read from the Swiss Re Institute, which was saying that actually, if we're going to take climate mitigation seriously, it's going to cost the global economy something like $23 trillion annually by 2050 in order to make those type of changes. And I accept that those are eye-watering numbers, and I just don't see how we're going to get from where we are in 2021 to that type of impact. But surely something's got to change, Joe. We can't go on as
So
we are.
when I see studies like that, those are not constructive. Those sort of numbers imply that we're stuck in what I call corner solutions. It's either 0 or 1. Either we go all out and we ignore the problem, or we're so frightened by what the problem implies that we grind our economies to a standstill. There has to be an alternative here, and the alternative is we're going to have to balance concerns around the environment and sustainability with legitimate needs of the public. One of the things that's really important here is how we approach how we regulate finance in thinking about what happens if we don't achieve our objectives and what's plan B. We're going to need sufficient growth, job creation. Yes, there'll be lots of job creation in the new economy that's green and sustainable and very high paying, but it's not going to replace wholesale what we have now. It's just going to be new and different. We're going to need to make sure that the financial system is resilient and flexible to respond to the needs as the economy evolves and as we move towards a more greener and sustainable future. And that may mean the need to finance the building of dikes, waterways, and canals to address rising sea levels in major cities in case we don't achieve those very ambitious goals laid out at the either COP21 or COP26. Now, I think we're going to achieve the goals, but we might not get beyond the 1.8 degree centigrade goal laid out by John Kerry. If that's the case, we're going to need to finance um, the response to further climate shock and further climate change. It's important here that we don't sell fairy tales, that we have an open and honest dialogue that's frank and leaves the room to address the needs in case human institutions, as they often do, fail to accomplish very necessary goals. And it's important that in forums like this, we talk to each other and
Yeah.
understand the variation out there, not just across economies, but governments, and governance.
Well, it's interesting, Joe, because I think, you've said to me before, we've got to make sure that we are not faced or backed into the corner in terms of a binary choice, a black or white choice in terms of climate change. Just expand on that. You're basically talking about this whole conversation piece, making sure that this is, gradual adaptation, but with a means to an end in terms of taking this seriously and making a difference.
The easiest way to kill the progress that's been made over the past decade is to present this as a binary choice. The public will intuitively reject that, and it will make things worse. When we opened the conversation, I said there's a certain component of all of this, a certain, we'll call it milieu out there, that's going to have to learn to accept yes for an answer. Things are improving. We are taking very progressive steps forward, but it's not going to be what they want right now. And I want to repeat this. It's very important when we're talking about the evolution to a cleaner, more sustainable future that we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We have to have a viable path, an alternative for those whose livelihoods involve exposure to fossil fuels. I live in Austin, Texas. And if you would have told me 10 years ago that 40% of electricity in Texas would be generated by wind, I would have said, you're out of your mind. Yet it is. And that move towards renewables was facilitated by the run up in the price of oil in the first decade of this century. Well, we're seeing another increase in the price of oil. It's not destabilizing, but it's causing some pain for households across the world. And it's useful that we remind ourselves that, okay, we need to talk to the public about this and remind them that over time, those higher prices will come back as we develop other alternatives, which then provide competition vis-a-vis the market mechanism and drives overall prices down. I want to say this here. So I have to have electricity for a fairly big abode. I run a Bloomberg terminal. It sucks up power, but that wind power, my electricity bill is about $7 American per week, 11 in the summer. That's it. Why? Because we've developed not just an alternative source of energy, but check this out. Texas is becoming a manufacturing hub for wind turbines. Texas. Boy, this really moves against type when you think about what Texas is and how people interpret it. But these are things that are happening. They're good things. And we need to move forward on this, in addition to areas such as energy storage, battery supply. We'll get there. But we're going to have some difficult conversations along the way. And our policymakers are going to have to do some heavy lifting. And most importantly, the advocates of a better, more cleaner future also are going to have to retool, I think, and reconnect with the publics in a way that they're not quite yet doing.
I think it's fascinating to hear about Texas. I would never have appreciated the amount of renewable energy that is being generated in Texas, which is all great to the Lone Star State. However, I would suggest that they're probably not embracing the transition to vegetarian and vegan food and away from meat and all the issues that has in terms of the climate emergency. So,
well, I tell you what,
I'll swing back and see.
You come to Austin, Texas, I'll take you to some great vegan restaurants. They're quite in vogue right now. You might be surprised. I
think Austin might be the island within. Okay, and a slightly more kind of esoteric question, Joe. And as an ex-Bloomberg economist, you're going to hate this one, but GDP as a measurement of wealth and activity, has it had its day? and by that I mean I was surprised to when I realised that GDP as a kind of global metric of wealth management of economies was only came about in the late 1930s. So, you know, is it does it work against the whole climate emergency? Take the example. There was a great example in the Raconteur magazine, which was in the Sunday Times recently, which was saying under GDP measurement, a tree, a 150-year-old carbon sucking tree, is valueless until the moment it's chopped down. Surely we've got to have a better way of measuring economic output than simply GDP.
Okay, so we're engaged in a great transition right now towards a newer economy, a different economy, one we've talked about, organized around digital technologies and indeed big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these things. And as we obtain more data and we're able to incorporate it into our metrics like GDP will evolve. The notion of measuring growth and adding value or subtracting value, identifying and assessing that also will evolve. So is GDP at its day? No, but we're learning more. Let me give you an example around the supply chain uh, disruption. Our friends over at the Royal Bank of Canada recently employed geospatial data to identify what was really happening inside shipping. And what they found out was that essentially the time in port had more than doubled. How could they do this? The use of very sophisticated data obtained via geosynchronous low orbit satellites. Okay, this wasn't around 20 years ago. We're now able to use this data to identify near real time activity that impacts not just growth but the policy solutions. As we begin to apply that to other areas of the economy, such as the environmental economy, it's going to alter our perceptions of growth, the composition of growth, and the quality of growth. And from that data will evolve innovations, both policy and in the real economy, that will alter and reshape our economies. And I can't say this enough. The evolution of the digital economy is rapidly transforming everything, including our environment. And as we move away from the idea of an economy organized around industry, basically 1750 to 2010, that's also going to reshape our ideas around how the economy works, how it operates, and the logic of policy put forward towards the economy. And to me, that's exciting. So is GDP at its day? No, it's not, but it's going to change. It's going to change for the better.
Do you think the markets will change, Joe? Do you think Wall Street and the City of London will change?
Sure, it will.
Okay.
The City of London is going to become greener. The financial center will slowly implement targets selected by the big companies to reduce their carbon footprint. You mentioned Mike Bloomberg. I worked for Mike, and I like Mike. Whether he was my boss or the mayor of New York, he moved in a direction that where he put his money where his mouth was. Right, that building we all called it the Death Star at 59th and Lexington in New York, or that magnificent building that's probably going to be turned into a museum one day in London. That's the Bloomberg headquarters. It's LEED certified. They compost. I mean, it's everything that you want a modern, large company to be. And he's been in the forefront. He's led. And I think it's not an accident that he's now taking the lead on a global basis to help large companies reduce their carbon footprint and move in a more sustainable direction. And indeed, at RSM US, RSM Canada, and RSM UK, my sense is we're going to have a vibrant ESG business going forward to help middle market companies identify how to reduce their carbon footprint, to help them around ESG, and perhaps over time to help them provide stress tests for their own companies as we move forward and address climate change on a much broader and deeper scale. That
And
to me is encouraging and constructive.
That is encouraging and constructive. And indeed, if you haven't already downloaded the ESG survey report produced by RSM UK and RSM US, please visit our website. There's some really good information there. And what I was surprised at is how many middle market businesses on both sides of the Atlantic have been embracing change. We've just had a question come in, Joe, from the audience. Do you think significant progress has been made at COP26, and what's your one major takeaway?
I think that I would say that yeah, we've had some significant progress. The illustration that you put forward earlier about Bolsonaro in Brazil
Yeah,
is just one example. My main takeaway is that the U.S., China, India, Russia, and Brazil are going to have to find ways to cooperate. That a repeat of the Cold War is both unnecessary and undesirable. That we're going to have to learn to talk to each other,
yeah,
even if we're going to be peer competitors, about the sustainability of the planet and really the sustainability of capitalism as it's in transition. Because one of the things I think that's not well understood is the environment is going to drive how we organize ourselves, how we work, how we live, how we eat, how we play. Um, but we need to make sure that we keep lines of communication open because rising sea levels hurts China just as it's going to hurt the United States. Even if it's not an existential crisis for either of those countries, the way it may be for the small island economies and countries in the Pacific. We need to address that too.
Well, it certainly will be for Miami, but I think the encouraging bit is just mentioning that cooperation agreement that was announced between the US and China. Those type of things, those type of conversations are happening. Joe, great. Don't go anywhere, Joe, because you're going to come back later. We've run out of time for this first session. Kevin, we're back with you. It's your show again. Hopefully, everyone has found that first session interesting and informative. And Joe, I really enjoyed getting your insights in terms of what's come out of COP26 on a macro level.